Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our National Campus Safety Awareness Month webinar. Today we will be discussing dating and domestic violence in the age of COVID-19. So glad that everyone could join us today. My name is Sarah Barrett, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Director of Training and Education for Clery Center. I'm the newest member to Clery Center, and I'm responsible for developing curriculum and training individuals participating in our Clery Act training seminars. I also am the lead for our National Campus Safety Awareness Month, or NACSAM, offerings. And prior to coming to Clery Center, I worked in both student services and as an administrator, and have experience writing and implementing university policy and overseeing various compliance programs, including Clery Act requirements, and compiling the annual security report each year. And now I'll pass that over to my colleague Laura to introduce herself.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. And yes, good afternoon or good morning to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us for our final NACSAM webinar of the year. I am pleased to work with Sarah today on this webinar and present this information to you. Sarah is a wonderful new addition to our staff, and I can't believe that these past 6 months have gone by so quickly. But my role at Clery Center is Senior Director of Programs. I collaborate a lot with Sarah on working to create and develop and further our education and training programs and resources for you all. And I'm really glad to be able to have this conversation with you all today. My background in student life, working in both residence life and student conduct roles on a campus, hopefully will help to inform our conversation as well. Thanks so much for the chance to introduce myself, Sarah.
Great. And as we jump in today, we do want to take a moment to acknowledge our NACSAM sponsors. Allied Universal is sponsoring today's webinar, so a big thank you to them. Allied Universal is a premier security and facility service company that provides unparalleled service and technology solutions, and you can find information about them at www.aus.com. Likewise, if you or your organization is interested in becoming a NACSAM or Clery Center sponsor, you can contact us at info@clerycenter.org with the subject line sponsorship. So if you've attended any of our webinars, even our latest webinar on intersectionality earlier this month, you know that we always like to ground ourselves in our presentations and a little bit of history about our organization and the Clery Act as well. So our organization was founded by two parents, Connie and Howard Clery, after the brutal rape and murder of their daughter, Jean Clery, who's shown here on the screen, in her residence hall by another student. And after Jean's death, Connie and Howard asked a lot of questions. They asked, why did this happen? How did this happen? Is there something that we could have done to prevent it? And after finding out that there had been a number of violent crimes in the years prior to Jean's arrival on campus and subsequent deaths, as there was no requirement for colleges and universities to share crime information, they really committed to working to create safer campus communities. And ultimately, their efforts resulted in a creation of a number of state and federal laws, most notably the Clery Act, which is the landmark federal law that requires college and universities to share information with their campus communities related to reporting crimes on and around campus, and then also specific information on policies and procedures. And as part of that work, the Clerys founded Security on Campus Incorporated, which was renamed in 2012 to honor the work of the Clerys. So as we think about what we do here at Clery Center, overall, Clery Center assists institutions with greater compliance and commitment to the Clery Act through key programming and actions. So education and training, we provide our comprehensive virtual, fundamentals, online, and even custom training. We engage in multiple speaking engagements, and we also offer webinars on a regular basis. We also participate in multiple initiatives. So Just like we're doing here today, National Campus Safety Awareness Month, we provide offerings as part of that. And we also promote additional initiatives like Kristen's Crusade, We Don't Haze, and our OVW, or Office of Violence Against Women, Campus Grant Program. And really, our Clery Center membership brings together our education and trainings and then our initiatives as we work with colleges and universities to build customized and sustainable approaches to campus safety and Clery Act compliance overall. And institutions that are members have access to exclusive services like annual security report reviews, free and discounted training material, customized assessments, and access to our extensive resource library. And we really endeavor to provide institutions with reliable information that they can use as they continue planning and developing your own approach to campus Clery Act compliance. And for those folks that are in attendance today, if you are already a Clery Center member, make sure to complete your member survey before September 25th. And for those of you that would like to learn more information about membership, Laura and I are happy to provide some additional information about what that might look like for your campus. So as we think about why we're here today, like I said, this is part of our National Campus Safety Awareness Month offering for 2020. And this year, our theme is the same yet different. And we got to this place because we recognize that in the wake of COVID-19 and the advancing civil rights movement, institutions around the nation were starting to reaffirm their commitments to campus safety. And as campus communities started to wrestle with this new normal, we really wanted to highlight the fact that the Clery Act remains the same. It's still a call to action. And throughout the month, we have worked to offer webinars, podcasts. If you haven't checked out our podcast, please make sure to take a listen there. And then applicable resources that really center conversations around personal and campus safety as they relate to the historic events in 2020, what we're all experiencing right now. And in doing that, using the Clery Act as a guidepost, because we know that the Clery Act can serve as a barometer for what's going on our campus communities and what our campus climate is like. And so ultimately, there's no doubt that 2020 will go down in history. I think we can all agree on that one. But we know, and as part of that, we know that every individual here today is navigating all of these events in their own way. And so once again, we really appreciate you all taking time to join us here today as we explore the Clery Act's continued relevance during a September that is the same yet very different. And so really that's where we want to start today as we're here in the same space and really exploring a topic together. I'd love to hear from you all. What is the biggest change for you as we adjust to life in a post-COVID-19 world? So feel free to share your thoughts here with in the chat box that you can see at the bottom of your screen. I would love to hear from folks really what has been the biggest change. Is it a matter of being at home? Are you working from home? Are you doing a little bit of a hybrid? Are you on campus some days? Is it the, inability to connect with people? Is it the over ability to connect with people now that we're virtual? Please share your thoughts on really what has been the biggest change for you as we adjust to a COVID-19 world. Okay. A lot of things coming in here, wearing masks, staying connected with people, working from home with a 4-month-old. Okay, we hear that. We understand for folks that might be doing caregiving or, have little ones at home, making personal connections over a virtual environment as teleworking. It's so difficult sometimes. Someone put here connecting virtually with students, especially during advocacy services or, something that could be so important to really have that engagement. Letting go of some of the mom guilt someone shared, maintaining boundaries. That is so important. You know, if you take a listen to our podcast, I don't want to give anything away, but we do ask each guest how they're dealing with COVID, or a life hack, as you will. So if you find yourself trying to figure out, okay, how do I do some boundaries? There's some good recommendations there, because really, yeah, people are sharing here heightened stress and balancing school, work, family, all of these things that are going on for us at the same time while we are still trying to navigate our new normal. Someone said, you know, wearing masks, doing the PPE, and really trying to stay safe in our different areas, maintaining social distance. You know, it's a whole new world out there, and yet we are still required to do so much of the same work that we've already had. And so, yes, you know, I really appreciate folks sharing here, because, you know, that's really what it comes down to, is in our own ways, on our own campuses, all across the country, really all across the world right now, we are working to navigate a semester that's the same yet different. And so today, what we'll be discussing is really something that came out of, you know, the COVID-19 shelter-in-place orders, the prevalence of dating and domestic violence across the country, what we started to see there. We'll review how the Clery Act addresses rights and options for dating and domestic violence survivors. We'll be discussing specific campus-based barriers and advantages for campus resources for victims and victim survivors of dating and domestic violence, and really sharing highlights from our updated guide to creating a written notification document. So that's definitely there and available for folks to download as we get further into this conversation here today. And really just to ground ourselves a little bit more, you know, kind of thinking back to how we got to this place. As the pandemic unfolded, we were inundated with news and developments about the COVID-19 virus, information about hotspots and positive testing rates and overall infection rates all dominated the news and our personal conversations so often. And likewise, slowly but surely, we began to see more information about COVID-19 and also some of the implications of the global pandemic. We began to hear more about the other global health crisis occurring, which was really increased rates of dating and domestic violence. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, during March 2020, contact volume decreased by 6% compared to March 2019. And as they started to work through why they might be seeing this occurrence, you know, one thought came forth as far as, you know, maybe it was more difficult for survivors to reach out for some of the support and resources. And we think that that was really affirmed in what we saw following March. So as the shelter-in-place orders were lifted, hotline contacts increased by 15% compared to where it was in April 2019. Moreover, about 10% of those contacts cited COVID-19 as a condition of their experience. However, we know dating and domestic violence have long been a health crisis. You know, for many, we always have the saying, home is where the heart is, but home could also be where the hurt is for a lot of folks. Even before COVID-19, the global health crisis of intimate partner violence existed. And for many, COVID-19 just brought that to further into the light. You know, according to the World Health Organization, violence is a leading cause of injury and disability, as well as a risk factor for other physical, mental, sexual, and reproductive health problems for a large segment of women around the world. And here we can see, you know, a tweet by United Nations Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez. And he said, peace is not just the absence of war. Many women under lockdown for COVID-19 face violence where they should be the safest, in their homes. And today, I appeal for peace in homes around the world. I urge all governments to put women's safety first as they respond to the pandemic. And I just thought that was so significant to see that coming from, the United Nations, or a representative within the United Nations, really acknowledging what so many individuals experience around the world. Here's just some additional stats. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, in the United States, more than 10 million adults experience domestic violence annually. Intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of all violent crime. And, from 2016 through 2018, the number of intimate partner violence victimizations in the United States increased 42%. And as we look at these numbers and these statistics, we can definitely make the distinction that, intimate partner violence has been and long been a global health crisis and something to be addressed. And for many folks, that was not their understanding. For many folks, they didn't understand just how great the prevalence of dating and domestic violence or intimate partner violence was. And so we saw this come up more so in the headlines that we began seeing after throughout COVID-19 and after some of the shelter-in-place orders were lifted. And, we can see here, for many individuals, they were experiencing a double pandemic, the coronavirus, and then also what they were experiencing at home as far as intimate partner violence goes. And as we consider the reasons for and experience of intimate partner violence, we must consider how COVID-19 influenced the occurrence of IPV. So as we look here, research confirms that more often than not, abuse is about power and control. Therefore, as survivors were forced to shelter in place, often with their abuser, the ongoing pandemic really exacerbated the methods abusers used to exert power and control over their partners. And some strategies used to exert power and control may come in the form of interpersonal or even structural tactics. If we look at the interpersonal side, abusive partners may restrict travel to gather basic necessities such as food or toilet paper. That might be restricted. Abusive partners may withhold pandemic necessities such as cleaning supplies, masks, or sanitizers. They could even be more brazen with their physical violence, knowing that their partner may not have the same type of interaction with others that might notice a black eye or a bruise. And then also we have to consider the structural implications here. So shelters may be full or may have stopped taking intakes for a while, and hotlines might be overwhelmed or have longer wait times. And then counseling centers or courthouses may have limited access or functionality. And so that's definitely something to consider for survivors as they try and utilize those resources. And then national and local travel restrictions could also impact escape or safety plans. And so really taking all of these different realities into consideration as we consider what that experience might have looked like for survivors. Because ultimately, as folks are trying to find their path forward, depending on what barriers might exist for them, related to the interpersonal side or structural side, may influence how they find that path forward and whether or not they can seek those resources and support necessary. And, that might be influenced also by their perception of the options and resources available to them. And that's where we kind of make that connection for students, because their path forward after experiencing dating or domestic violence might be influenced by unique advantages or barriers directly related to being on campus, just like it might be directly related for an individual during the COVID-19 context. And so as we think about campus advantages and barriers, it's important to consider what that might look like for an individual as they consider reporting as they are seeking services and accessing accommodations. So as we think about some of those advantages, there might be additional support on campus in the form of a campus victim survivor advocate or maybe peer support. Information might be more readily available, especially as we think about some of our students living in residence halls where they may have programming or other programming happening on campus. And then essentially the processes may be more clearly outlined in a policy or somewhere where that can be very explicitly identified as far as what the process is if they were to experience dating or domestic violence. And then access to campus-specific resources, sometimes maybe at a low-cost option, whether that be our counseling or other services. They may have specific advantages being on campus, knowing that those resources exist. But likewise, disadvantages may also present for individuals on campus. Peer pressure may present in many different forms and has the potential to impact academics, social connections for individuals that have experienced dating or domestic violence. Survivors may find it more difficult to end relationships or to gain space from an abuser on campus. So depending on if they live in the same residence hall, maybe they take the same classes, there may be some additional barriers there for that individual. Likewise, it may be difficult for survivors to find support within their own social circle. Many college students report that they do not feel equipped to deal with dating abuse. And, oftentimes respondents may say that they have found it difficult identifying dating abuse or that they don't know how to seek help for someone who might be experiencing it. And that can often play into another barrier that we've seen on campuses related to divergent processes and expectations related to campus disciplinary processes and legal reporting. So if many individuals say they don't know how to seek help or they don't know where to go, that may be exacerbated by these different processes occurring. And so likewise, many folks may now oversee work related to campus processes and may be implementing changes as a result of the new Title IX regulations. And to those, I would remind you that change often brings opportunity, which may be the exact opportunity you need to be able to move this bullet point from a disadvantage to an advantage on your campus. A chance to break down some of those barriers for folks that might be seeking assistance. And so this is just a place where I really want to highlight as a chance for you to center really the spirit of the Clery Act in those conversations and to evaluate who is at the table as you work to implement those changes on your campus. And in just a moment, Laura will take some time to discuss some intersections between Title IX and Clery, but first I want to take a moment just to pause to see if there are any questions that have come up for folks thus far. And you can feel free to go ahead and put those in the group discussion box if you do have those questions. And as we kind of take a look and see what questions might exist, we'll try and answer those, and then we'll also continue to move throughout the rest of the presentation. So just want to take a few moments here to go ahead and pause and let folks know that this would be a time that you can ask some of those questions that you might have so far. Okay, so it looks like, one thought coming in is so much of the focus from maybe university leadership has been related to COVID-19, and it could make it challenging to engage and partner with university partners on things that are not directly related to COVID. And that's such a great point. You know, right now where we're navigating so many different things going on in the world, we're also navigating so many different priorities. And, you know, this could be a really great way for you to make that connection and thinking about something that was highlighted through COVID, you know, the increase in prevalence in dating and domestic violence, but then also bringing that back to campus to say, hey, we know that these things have been occurring on campus already. We know that we've been tracking these crimes, you know, since 2015 when some of these were added. And so really talking through how you can take, you know, even maybe the the attention of COVID and redirect that to something that might be going on your campus, but then also to refocus that related to some of the needs and being able to garner some of that attention and some of that prioritization to something else directly related to a compliance need. So great thought there. We'll continue to kind of go through and have another pause and then another break as we continue with the presentation today. So if you weren't able to ask a question or weren't able to get your thought out just now, know that you'll have some additional time for that in just a few moments as we move into this next section here. And now I'll go ahead and pass it over to Laura as she talks through some of the intersections between Clery and some other regulations.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks to all of you for your great comments. And I know some of you were typing questions and then maybe thought differently, so don't hesitate to submit those questions. If there is hesitation, please feel free to use the tech support section if you would rather submit a question privately, and then we can still ask the question aloud, but you won't be indicating yourself as you're asking it in case that's a hesitation for folks. But yes, so Sarah has set us up great to kind of reflect back right now on why is it even important that we're talking about dating and domestic violence in relation to COVID. And I know many of you right now are on campuses that are in the midst of your fall reopening plans, whether that is that you are all in person or all online and working remotely or a hybrid, or you started out one way and now you're moving into a different way. We think it's a really important time to consider this, you know, peeling back of the layers that happened back in the spring and summer with seeing such an uptick in reporting of folks needing help in domestic violence and dating violence situations due to shelter-in-place requirements and quarantining requirements connected with the pandemic. Because when that happened in the spring and summer, it was, you know, for some people it was this shock and surprise. For a lot of other people, it was a quite obvious result that occurred because there was not enough time or care taken into sending everybody home from campus. And we could, you know, spend a whole other webinar talking about that decision-making process and whether or not, you know, that was just a terrible byproduct that was stoppable or not preventable because of the time that people had to make those kinds of decisions. So what we want to bring to your attention with this is now folks have had time to make decisions. And now folks have more time to think about how those plans have played out this fall semester and have had more time to start thinking about how they can have implications in the spring. And so we don't want to forget about the fact that this uptick in domestic violence and dating violence occurrences and in some ways reports happened as a result of people being limited in where they could go or who they could seek support from, especially as we move into a time of year that for many parts of this country will require a lot more inside time because of winter weather. I know already, you know, campuses are having breaks from Thanksgiving through February 1st. If there were, you know, folks on right now and they go back. So it's not a problem that's going to go away. It's something that we really need to be prepared to respond to as campus administrators and campus safety folks, or be thinking proactively now about the ways in which we can remind people about resources available to them or other alternative living situations they can seek out when they are required to quarantine or shelter in place in the future. And so it's even more relevant right now to consider these types of concerns because of the renewed connection between the Clery Act and Title IX with the passage of the Title IX regulations that went through in May. Even before those regulations passed, under the Clery Act, due to the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act back in 2013, the Clery Act has considered dating and domestic violence to be Clery crimes for which you submit Clery statistics each year, and additionally provide certain prevention, response, and disciplinary procedures for in both student and employee cases. So this is a point that I do want to stress because I think it can be easily forgotten, and I know we have a really encouraging broad audience today. So in 2013, the Violence Against Women Act, which is a very large law encompassing multiple aspects of life, it was reauthorized, and in that reauthorization, it amended the Clery Act to expand already existing rights and options for survivors of sexual assault and extended rights and options to survivors of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking as well. And for Clery, that applies to students and employees. So if you are an employee at your institution and you are in or know somebody who is dealing with a domestic violence or dating violence situation that has only worsened with learning or working remotely requirements, there are pieces within the Clery Act that apply to you as well. And now, with Title IX defining sexual harassment in part as also actions that meet the Clery Act definitions of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, campuses have even more reason to turn their attention to what you are doing to prevent and respond to dating and domestic violence in particular. So more than ever before, there is an intersection between these three federal laws when it comes to dating and domestic violence. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time walking through what those requirements are and how we got to where we are right now. So when the VAWA Amendments to Clery passed, and just a brief history lesson there, like Sarah said, we do like to ground our trainings in history so that we can really be empowered to look forward in a clear way. When those amendments passed in 2013, they added new offenses to Clery crime statistics. So that would be what we already said, dating and domestic violence as well as stalking. They also added bias categories for hate crime classification. So the category of gender identity was added as a bias category, and national origin and ethnicity were separated out into their own bias categories. And then on top of that, there were requirements added for campuses to have certain prevention programs in place for new and current students and employees that specifically address those four crimes: dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And then also certain response procedures in place, meaning that there were certain actions that campuses had to engage in if they received a report of one of those four crimes from either a student or an employee. And then further, campuses had to have certain aspects of their disciplinary proceeding in place for those types of incidents, in both student and employee cases. And what I can't stress enough is that these amendments did not just say, these are things you should be doing. They said that you had to have a policy in place at the institutional level to guide those actions, particularly for prevention, response, and disciplinary proceedings. So now, with the passage of the Title IX regulations that came through in May, there are disciplinary proceedings in addition to what Clery says that must be in place for cases that rise to the level of a dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking incident, as those terms are defined under Clery. So there is a connection there. And it's just important to know all these pieces, because even if you are somebody that's considered a campus security authority at your institution, You might not have ever had somebody report to you that they were a survivor of a domestic violence or a dating violence incident. And now, because there is increased potential for those types of situations to occur, you might be receiving information that you didn't before. So it's even more important that you understand the rights and options that are attached or connected to survivors in these situations, so that even remotely, you can ensure they're getting the information that they need. Because at the end of the day, the Clery Act really is a consumer protection law, ensuring that there is transparency between campus community members and the institution of higher education. So at a minimum, there is an obligation for that clear information sharing, particularly around things like your rights and options when you are a victim of crime. And so as we move forward here, we just want to make sure that you all are on the same page with what do we even mean when we say dating and domestic violence, right? So when the Violence Against Women Act amended Clery, we said one of the things that happened was it added crimes to be counted as a Clery crime statistic. And so when we think about Clery statistics holistically, the Department of Education breaks the crimes up into 4 categories or buckets. One being criminal offenses, even though technically all of these could be considered criminal offenses. You have that first category of criminal offenses. Hate crimes flow from that list. And then you have what they would call Violence Against Women Act offenses. And they are called that because these 3 terms are defined under the Clery Act as they are defined under the Violence Against Women Act. So the definitions for these terms are drawn from the Violence Against Women Act itself, because they are the federal definitions for these terms. So we're going to highlight those today and review them with you here. I'm actually also going to drop into the group discussion pod 2 links that I think you would find helpful as we move forward in this conversation. So this first link is to the Federal Register of the final version of the Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act. So these are the regulations for the Clery Act as amended by the reauthorization of VAWA. I find this format to be much more helpful to read. It's more like a web page as opposed to the skinny actual Federal Register, the official version. And what we always stress to folks when they read the definitions or read, the regulations is the majority of the regs is what's called the preamble. The preamble is the summary of points that were brought up by negotiated rulemaking participants and then the Department of Education's response to those points. And that's going to come up as we talk about the definition of dating and domestic violence. So for the definition of dating violence, it is very clearly under the Clery Act and pulled from the, the VAWA definition, the threat or act of physical or sexual violence between individuals in a social relationship of a romantic or intimate nature. And then the existence of such a relationship shall be determined based on the reporting party's statement and with consideration of these factors: how long the relationship has been going on, the type of relationship, and how frequently these individuals interact. What is important to note, and the reason I brought the Federal Register link into the group discussion, is that the preamble talks about how dating violence under Clery is not intended to capture things like emotional or psychological abuse. And it goes through a little bit of the discussion for the reasons why they thought that that was not appropriate. But what we can't stress enough is that even though this is how dating violence is defined for Clery purposes, that really is only important insofar as counting your incidents for Clery crime statistics purposes. So all of the statistics under the column of dating violence in your annual security report should be incidents that meet this definition of dating violence. But at your institution, if your policy to adjudicate dating violence would go beyond this definition, up until now, that was totally permissible and still in some ways can be permissible in that your version of dating violence might be broader than the Clery definition. In terms of adjudicating that behavior, that's totally permissible. What you might need to think through, though, now is dating violence as defined under Clery would also be considered a Title IX incident. And so if there is action that falls outside of this definition, it would not necessarily be adjudicated by your Title IX policy. It would most likely be adjudicated through your existing student conduct policy. But you all probably are at institutions that are currently making decisions about how to handle that Title IX policy. Will you have just one type of response for any of these actions? Will you have two separate policies, one that is just for Title IX actions and one Title IX incidents? So those are all good questions to think through, but I just wanted to draw attention to that one piece of the dating violence definition because I do know that we get that question frequently. And so the other term that, obviously is important to consider today is domestic violence. And so domestic violence, as defined under Clery, which again is using the VAWA definition of this term, is a felony or misdemeanor crime of violence committed by a person in one of these four categories. And the thing I'd like to draw your attention to here is the fourth category, the fourth bullet, where it says that last phrase, or a youth victim who is protected from that person's acts under the domestic or family violence laws of the jurisdiction in which the crime of violence occurred. So what that is basically saying, it's a catch-all to say, and if your local jurisdiction includes any other type of relationship other than the ones we've highlighted here as one that would be falling under domestic violence, then that is also something that you should count as a domestic violence incident. And I know today's session really isn't all about how to appropriately count incidents, but I think some of this information is just helpful context for you all to have, especially if you're folks to whom individuals or survivors are reporting, so you can help them make sense of, one, how to get support and what rights and options are available to them, but also so they can understand if their incident is or is not captured in those statistics or in the daily crime log, for example. So one other thing that I wanted to point out, and a really helpful resource that we tend to share with folks during these sessions, is the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting. This is a document that's published by the Department of Education, designed to help campuses interpret the regulations for the Clery Act. And within this document, there is an explanation of the definition of domestic violence that I wanted to draw your attention to. So if you are familiar with this document, you would know that it's not necessarily something you read front to back. It's more of a reference document. But what I wanted to pull up for you is page 3-, and I'm getting there. Sorry, I had it 2 seconds ago. Yeah, 3-37 into 3-38. What I thought would be helpful to point out here is that the handbook says that even though some local jurisdictions might consider roommates to be a relationship that is captured under a domestic violence definition, the Department of Education never intended for these crime statistics to reflect incidents that happened between roommates. When this guidance first came out in the handbook back in 2016, Clery Center went to the Department of Education to ask them about this because it's not so clear that they are acknowledging that there are some jurisdictions in which roommates are a protected relationship in a domestic violence definition. So they have verbally shared in multiple spaces that campuses that are in states or jurisdictions where roommates would fall under the domestic violence definition, you have the option of including incidents that happened between roommates as domestic violence in your Clery statistics, or you could invoke this language from the handbook as the reason for why you do not incidents in your domestic violence Clery statistics. 8 of the handbook, it says, this is the relationship between two folks must be more than being roommates in order for it to be counted as domestic violence. But the fourth bullet point in the definition that we use accounts for other relationships captured in a local jurisdiction. So I bring this up because you all might be receiving reports or hearing about incidents between roommates that are quarantining off campus or that are living on campus that are having an increased risk of violence occurring because of the added stress of the pandemic and working and living remotely, etc. So if you are in a state that considers roommates to be a category for which violence between those people would count as domestic violence, you have the option for counting those incidents as domestic violence Clery crime statistics, or you can choose to invoke the Clery guidance here and say that was never the department's intention, therefore we do not count those in our statistics. If you are not in a state where roommates are in the DV definition, then you don't really have to worry about this. But I just wanted to draw it out because it's a question we tend to get around this area. And if I've thoroughly confused you, I totally apologize, but I at least wanted to highlight these two resources and maybe draw out some things that might be going through your heads as you are navigating response to these types of incidents on your campuses. And so one other, quick thing to just remind folks about is this very high-level slide about Clery geography. The Department of Education has said verbally that locations that would not be, well, let me correct that. In general, Clery is very specific around privately owned businesses and personal residences are typically not considered Clery geography. Clery geography is defined by buildings or property for which the institution of higher education has a written agreement to use space. But this question came up with COVID pieces because so many people are now working and living remotely in private homes. Campuses were starting to wonder, could there now be some way that those places are considered Clery geography? And when we had asked the department about that, they have given us verbal guidance back saying, no, these would not be considered Clery geography locations. So if you are receiving reports from individuals that they are experiencing domestic or dating violence in places that would not be Clery geography, you might not count that incident as a Clery crime statistic, but that does not mean that you wouldn't share information with those survivors about their rights and options, about how to proceed or accommodations they could receive or assistance that they could get in reporting that information. And what we're about to talk through are what some of those rights and options are and how you can work on presenting that information to your campus community. So in general, once somebody comes forward as a survivor of dating or domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, they should be given written information on their rights and options around the importance of preserving evidence, how to make a report, both on and off campus, accommodations they could receive in regards to academic, living, transportation, working situations, as well as protective measures, and then information about disciplinary procedures. In general, under the Clery Act, all students and employees should receive written information around once a year that identifies on and off-campus service providers in these categories listed here, so counseling, health, mental health, victim advocacy, legal assistance, as well as visa and immigration assistance and student financial aid, as those services connect to dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So the left-hand side of the screen is information that should be given generally to all students and employees in writing about once a year. And then when a survivor comes forward, they should also be given information in writing about their rights and options and accommodations that are available and how to receive those accommodations. And this is important because the provision of the information to all students and employees ensures that people are getting that information, hopefully, before they are a victim. So they have some of that access to information and resources in advance of being in a desperate situation, or you are able to help somebody that you know. And you can see that some of these service providers would be helpful even outside of dating and domestic violence or sexual assault or stalking situations. It would always be good to know where can I go to get more information on visa and immigration pieces in general. Where can I go to get information on student financial aid or mental health services? So just to highlight how these are two ways that a campus should be providing information in writing. And so with that, I'm actually going to also pause before we move into our final section where we give you some tools and strategies to communicate the information that you might want to give to survivors and how that can be adapted or adopted as you're thinking about a post-COVID world or a current COVID world. So this is a good place to take another one of those Q&A breaks to just see if there are any questions coming up for folks after all of that like rather dense Clery information. So I see a question that just came in here. So what is your view on roommates and Title IX for those of us in jurisdictions that include roommates as domestic violence? I understand the DOE's intent of the Title IX regulations was not for platonic roommates, but for those of us with roommates included in state domestic violence, it seems like we're stuck with dealing with roommate situations, which puts a strain on our process. So for the roommates and Title IX piece, so when I was talking about that, the Department of Education guidance, that was all in connection to the Clery Act. It was not in relation to Title IX. So the Department of Education has said that the Clery Act definition of domestic violence was never intended to capture actions that happen between roommates, but they didn't realize that the fourth part of their definition that they use does allow for that to be captured. So if you are in a jurisdiction where roommates are a relationship that could fall under domestic violence law, you have the choice for Clery purposes of deciding whether or not to count incidents that are occurring between roommates as domestic violence or not. For Title IX purposes, you know, now Title IX is saying that the definition of domestic violence and dating violence as defined in the Clery Act would fall under Title IX situations. So if you are having a situation that is just, if you're talking about like just quote unquote aggravated assault, but because it's occurring between two roommates, now you're treating it as domestic violence and now you have to run it through a Title IX process. I think that's a really great question, an area that folks are probably sussing out themselves right now as to what the best thing is to do. I would say, I know this is maybe an unhelpful answer, but it really depends on your campus and the culture at your campus, how many types of cases you are already getting or you're anticipating having to move through the Title IX process. But my understanding from a Clery lens is you have the ability to, you know, make that determination for when you're at least determining statistics in terms of whether or not you can have a choice as to include a domestic violence situation between roommates as Title IX or not. I think that's a great question for OCR to comment on in a more specific way, but absent getting answers from them, I would say your best bet is to look to your campus process and capacity for dealing with those types of situations and seeing how that would impact your Title IX process versus not. But my inclination would be, you know, because that definition of domestic violence is capturing incidents that are roommates, you are probably wanting to think about how would we handle, you know, those types of incidents and as a Title IX process situation. I hope that helps answer your question, Heather. Diane, you asked where does it discuss sending out options and rights once a year? How should that be done? Okay, so I wasn't saying sending out written information on rights and options once a year. The information on the left-hand side of your screen is written information that should go to all students and employees. The handbook references at one point that annually is a good way to do that, and I can point out the page number for that if that's helpful. But that is talking about on and off-campus service providers in each of these categories. So you are talking about where folks can access counseling, health, mental health, victim advocacy services, and you should be providing their, you know, the name of the service provider and contact information for the service provider in writing to all students and employees. I hope that And then also, yes, this annual notification of options and rights to you when the ASR is distributed. So no, this is not an annual notification of rights and options. The information on the right-hand side of your screen is what should be provided to victims when they come forward and make a report, which is including information about rights and options. And Sarah's going to actually get into an example written notification that could be given to victims in a moment, so that'll hopefully clarify this point. But the information that should be sent out annually is in what needs to go to students and employees on the left-hand side of the screen. Connecting that to your annual security report, I will say that the ASR provision would not satisfy providing written notification to all students and employees, as that is intended to be a standalone document. So I hope that answers those questions. I am now going to turn it back over to Sarah, who's going to walk you through an actual resource that you can put to use right now from this year's NACSAM product. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you, Laura. So exactly what Laura said, you know, as we think about NACSAM, one of our goals is to help provide resources and opportunities for further conversation for professionals in the field. And this year, our NACSAM participants will actually have first access, so you all here today will have the first access to our Clery Center guide to creating a sample written notification. And this guide will help you as you work to create or to update a written notification that clearly outlines the rights and options for survivors of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Within the document, you will find information about requirements under the Clery Act and also ways to personalize your document to better support survivors as they explore their options for reporting and support and the resources available to them. So if you haven't downloaded that as part of the files there on your screen, make sure to do that before our time together is over. Within the document itself, you'll find very specific information such as the accommodations and supportive measures that should be included in the written information or in the written notification provided to survivors. It should be noted that accommodations or supportive measures may be provided before or after the filing of a formal complaint and where no formal complaint has been filed. These services should be and can be provided to both the complainants and respondents during a disciplinary process, and more so, this information can be provided regardless of whether or not the individual chooses to report to local or campus police or public safety, and there are specific options available to them if requested and are reasonably available. And so within this section, we do also indicate the term supportive measures because that is distinguished between the Clery Act and Title IX, so that is in regards to Title IX, while the term accommodation might be used in reference to the Clery Act. And so it's really important as we think about, once again, those barriers that folks might find themselves up against on campus, also ensuring that our language reflects our different policies on campus. So, you know, if we're talking Clery language, then we're saying accommodations. But if someone is more familiar with Title IX, they may be familiar with the term supportive measures. And so that's just another way for us to help break down some of those barriers as we are trying to share with folks what information or what resources are available to them. And so as you think about the accommodations or supportive measures that should be made available in relation to housing accommodations, academic accommodations, transportation or escort accommodations, and then also working accommodations. Once again, remembering that this is provided for all members of campus, so not just our students, but also our employees. And then additional protective measures, including an institutional no contact order. We also added in an additional accommodation or supportive measure that's not required, but something to be considered related to financial assistance accommodations. So information on financial accommodations that might be helpful, knowing that financial control might be an element of dating or domestic abuse. So as you're considering what accommodations or supportive measures are made available, also taking time to know if any or all of these accommodations might be or might not be applicable in the remote context. Once again, going back to our COVID-19 considerations, as many universities are moving to online or maybe more hybrid models. Therefore, as you are updating your current notification, or maybe you're considering generating a new written notification, think about this context and how some options may be available, or how someone might need to seek those out in a remote option or remote element. And then also thinking through those resources. So once again, going back, because the written notification is required for all campus community members, specifying which services are targeted for students versus employees if there are any distinctions on your campus. This is especially helpful as individuals might be seeking this information to identify their needs and options following the experience of dating, domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And these options here are broken up by campus and community. So thinking about building relationships within your own community is something that's important to consider, as it allows you to provide better service to the individuals on your campus. So for example, student financial aid might just apply to students, while visa and immigration might apply to both. And so really thinking through, as a survivor is finding their path and making their way through resources that might be applicable, how you can best present that information in a way that is accessible and easy to understand. So as we think about, once again, taking a closer look at the advantages or barriers, obviously developing a written notification is one of those first steps that you can do in supporting survivors on your campus. But as you work to ensure that your document is meeting the needs of your campus, taking some time to assess whether or not it's accessible and inclusive. So have you considered including languages or imagery representative of your campus community? Maybe, your mascot on campus is a tiger. Having some imagery that relates it back to your campus, something that they're familiar with. Indicating whether or not services are multilingual or designed for a specific community or identity group. So calling attention to specific services, so folks, as they are making that assessment, can have a deeper understanding as to their ability to access certain areas. And then ensuring campus and community-based service providers offer services that are inclusive and accessible for all communities. So really thinking through how you might present that information, and the places within your campus community and then your local community that could best serve folks from all types of different identities and backgrounds. In our intersectionality webinar, we touched on some of the different ways in which we might consider making not only our language but also our systems and our offices more inclusive of all the different identities that folks might hold, and all the different folks that might be utilizing these services at one point or another. And then also working to think through the distribution. There were some questions there related to the notification and what that would look like to ensure that we are making this information available for folks, not just in the moment after they have experienced crime, but also for folks as they work to assist individuals, but to also normalize this information being shared, so folks could have access to it, not just during a time wherein they might have experienced a crime. And then also identifying the mechanisms to distribute things to faculty and staff in support positions, or faculty and staff that might also experience some type of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And as we think about really the intent of our NACSAM services or NACSAM offerings, we take this time today to take a closer look at the Clery crimes of dating and domestic violence in the context of COVID. So hopefully folks and attendees were able to better understand how the Clery Act addresses the rights and options for individuals that have experienced these crimes, but as well as some of the advantages and barriers that folks might face on campus and the importance of the written notification. Because ultimately, we want to ensure that as folks are experiencing these crimes, they have the resources available to them. And so we know that in creating the guide itself, it might feel overwhelming to think about all the different things that might need to be included and whether or not they're meeting the requirements. And so Clery Center has taken some of that guesswork out of creating that document for you. So in the guide itself, we not only provide the information related to things that are required under the law, but then also ways for you to make the document personalized to ensure that it is meeting the needs of your campus community, because ultimately we don't know your campus community as well as you know your campus community. And so hopefully in using this guide to create something that is applicable and effective for your campus community. And we know that many of you are actually doing great work already and have already created guides or have already created written notifications. And so we would encourage you to share those with us. You can feel free to email those to us because we like to see what folks across the country are doing. Sometimes we have folks share things with us that are great ideas, and we would love to highlight that for other peers as you work to create your guide, or if someone has something within their guide that's a really great idea that maybe you can adapt for your own campus. And so once again, just as you think about the resources that you all have, feeling free to share those with us, and knowing that we will highlight some of those as well. So as we move through, we know that there's some questions that have come up in the group discussion, so we do want to allow for some questions overall related to the content here as we've shared today. Anything else that came up as we have touched on some of these different areas, not only related to the prevalence of dating and domestic violence as a result of COVID-19, but also some of the barriers and advantages that individuals might experience while being on campus. So if you do have any questions, you can feel free to add those to the group discussion now, and we will take those questions and answer them. But while questions are coming in, I also want to make sure that we highlight all of our NACSAM offerings that we've had so far this month, and to share with you what's still upcoming. So today is our second webinar, Interpersonal Violence or Dating Violence in the Age of COVID. And then we've had multiple podcasts throughout the month. We had our introduction to NACSAM, and then we last week released a conversation with our Network for Victim Recovery of DC and VRDC about how intersectionality can inform direct services. And then next week we will have our last interview with Bill Mitchell, who is an advocate. He's a Clery Center board member and also experienced just a heartbreaking tragedy of losing his daughter to dating violence as a result of dating violence. So definitely make sure to listen out for those. And with that, I will go ahead and take a look at some of our questions here to get through anything remaining for questions for our group here. It looks like the latest one.
Thanks,
here.
Sarah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there are a couple questions that I can answer so you can take a breath, Sarah, because I know you've been chatting here. Yeah, no problem. So I worry that I may have confused folks. I'm going to go back a couple slides here. There are a lot of questions about if the information on the written information that should go to students and employees is in the ASR, is that sufficient? So there is an interpretation that Clery Center takes to answer that. So I'm going to point folks to page 8-22 in the handbook. So I'll put that in the group discussion. 8-22 in the handbook talks about the written explanation of rights and options that should be provided to a student or employee that comes forward as a survivor of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. So this is in relation to this requirement on the right-hand side of the screen, to victims after a report. The handbook says that this documentation should be a prepared, standardized, written set of materials, including detailed information about victims' rights and options, and does not mean that you hand the student a copy of the ASR or the policy statements contained in the ASR. So following that logic, we apply that to the statement of on and off-campus services for all students and employees. Because what is in the handbook should be a statement that says that you will provide that information to students and employees. But and also should be what those on and off-campus services are. But the provision of an ASR or the making of an ASR public alone, in our interpretation, following the Department of Education's guidance in a similar other requirement, we would not find that that is acceptable. We recommend that campuses have a standalone document for the written information. And that can be twofold. Like I know folks are saying here, isn't the point of displaying the ASR on our website so that anybody can get the information? So yes, absolutely, that could be a purpose. But what we like to think of as well is that the ASR is a reference document. It is not something that is necessarily easily read or read cover to cover, and there are certain parts of it that can and should be pulled out and highlighted so that folks are not searching through a large document to get information that they need. So we do recommend that folks create a standalone document for both the annual notification of on and off-campus services to all students and employees, as well as the written explanation of rights and options. And that is the guide that Sarah shared with you all, is the resource that we've created for NACSAM. It's like a sample way to create that written notification of rights and options. My computer is acting a little funny, so I think there are two other questions that came through that I just did not see, but thank you, Cheryl, for sharing them. So one of them is saying, can you share more statistics or research about dating violence and domestic violence during COVID, reports, research, etc.? So I know, Sarah, you could include in maybe the group chat some of the citations that you had for the statistics from those earlier slides, if that would be helpful for folks. So yeah, I see another question in the group discussion. Are you saying that we have to provide an annual notification of rights and options to all students and employees? So no, that is not what we're saying. The slide 21 breaks it down exactly exactly what the Clery Act requires. Rights and options are information that needs to be provided to victims or survivors that come forward, whether they are a student or employee. So that is who receives rights and options about importance of preserving evidence, reporting options, accommodations, all those pieces. All students and employees should receive written information on and off-campus services in all of the categories, and that are on the left-hand side of slide 21, that are also highlighted on this slide, slide 24. This is the information that should be going out to all students and employees. And I mean, I think it also just kind of follows that for your written explanation of rights and options, which is what this sample guide is, that's in your files pod as well, the written notification handout, it's also helpful to probably review that annually, because those service provider pieces could also change, even though they all might be internal. Is that clear for folks? Is there any other questions around the written explanation of rights and options versus written information on and off-campus services? They're two separate requirements. I see another, and Sarah, thank you so much for starting to provide those statistics sources there. there was one other question that came through that said, can you point us to info and considerations on Clery and changes to Title IX? We have, that's pretty broad, so I don't know what exactly you might be looking for, but we do have a section of our website that is dedicated to Title IX and resources that we created earlier this year that review both the intersections between the Clery Act and Title IX, and then some areas to consider that might be causing campuses particular complications. So I will provide that website. So that is clerycenter.org / oh boy, if I could spell title right, that would be helpful, Title IX. And the handbook reference for the written information for all students and employees is handbook page 8-14. That is what I had, I believe, referenced earlier. And then the written explanation of rights and options is 8-22. And so those pages, honestly, the entire Chapter 8 in the handbook is really helpful to understand the VAWA amendments to the Clery Act. So I would definitely recommend reviewing all of Chapter 8. I see some other questions coming through here that we can answer. So I see a question of, will an email out to all individuals, students, and employees for the annual notification work for the items on the left, understanding that the items on the right need to be provided to people in writing upon an actual report? Sure, yeah, so an email that goes out to all students and employees would certainly serve as written notification for the on and off-campus service providers, yes. And then separately, right, when you receive a report, when a student or employee comes forward saying they are the survivor of dating or domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, you should be providing them in writing information on their rights and options. Great. Yeah, sure, no problem. I see a question here. Will some of the examples from other institutions for the rights and options brochure be shared on the Clery Center website? That is a great question. I know that right now we don't even have any, so we're just kind of asking for folks to share them with us to see if you have to provide different examples out. So I think we'll develop a more clear process for that once we see if people take us up on the offer, but we'll be sure to make the process by which we would share those clear once it becomes real. But Sarah, feel free to speak to that more clearly as well. I know that was your piece of the presentation.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways for us to continue this conversation, you know, outside of NACSAM. And, you know, as we think about the different resources available, you know, that's where, you know, you think about membership and how that might look for your campus. Getting some of that exclusive access to resources from Clery Center and then also from peers, but then also how do we continue that conversation moving forward as folks are coming up with great ideas and ways to serve their campus community. And so whether that is on the website or through a different mechanism, we're definitely open to finding additional ways for folks that are on the ground doing the good work of Clery to be able to have these additional conversations and to share resources and to be able to build off of the good work that's already been done, because it can feel difficult sometimes, like you're reinventing the wheel. And that's one of the other reasons why we created the guide to creating the written notification, so it doesn't feel as though you're starting out of thin air, that you could have some of that guidance as you're working to create something that works for you and your campus. So good question. Feel free to go ahead and share those, and then once we are in a place and make a determination as to how we might further share those with the larger campus community, we'll definitely make sure that that is communicated clearly.
Sarah, thanks. So we had a couple questions come through. So one is from Julia, the guide that you're providing, so that would be the written notification guide that's in your files pod. You're okay with us using your document with customization that applies to your respective campuses. So yes, we certainly are. That's the intention of this document. You'll see as you go through it that some parts would make sense to use our language and some parts it's just instructions to you for the language that you would need to develop. So it should be self-explanatory, but if you have any questions about that, you can just let us know. But then there was, you're welcome, no problem. Another question that came through was with regards to the annual security report and VAWA definitions. It is my understanding that our ASR should reflect the Department of Education handbook definitions. If we have a Title IX policy, does a school Title IX policy need to match the ASR VAWA definition? So I realize I maybe confused folks more than I intended earlier with the description around definitions. I'm going to try to further clarify this. So instead of calling them, they are VAWA offenses, but we really are talking about Clery crimes here, Clery definitions. The VAWA Amendments amended the Clery Act, but it is more helpful to just refer to them as the Clery Act. So the definitions under the Clery Act, those Clery crime definitions, they are the ones that you should be using to determine if incident reports that come through align with those definitions when counting Clery crime statistics. When it comes to policies that adjudicate that behavior, for Clery purposes, the definitions of the terms dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, at a minimum, must align with the Clery definition. Prior to the Title IX regulations, we would instruct by saying that your institutional policy might go beyond what the Clery definitions have in them, and that is okay. You just could not go narrower than the Clery definition of those terms. Again, this is just for adjudicating behavior. For your Clery crime statistics, you are using the Clery definitions. You are determining if incidents align exactly with those Clery definitions, and then you are counting them as Clery statistics if they occur in Clery geography. For your disciplinary processes for adjudicating behavior, at a minimum, your Clery definitions should be used, and prior to May 6, 2020, we would have said, and you can expand on those definitions in your policy. Now there is a complicating layer in that Title IX defines sexual harassment. The third prong of the definition is anything that meets the definition of the Clery definitions of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So to answer your question about what definitions should be in your Title IX policy, it would depend on what your Title IX policy is designed to do. Because at a minimum, your Title IX policy should be addressing behavior that meets the definition of sexual harassment as defined under Title IX. Some campuses are saying we don't want to have multiple disciplinary processes. We want to have one process for all of that behavior. So even for behavior that doesn't meet the definition of sexual harassment under Title IX, we are going to apply the Title IX disciplinary requirements to simplify things. So if that's the case, then your campus might use an expanded definition for dating violence and domestic violence, but you would be using Title IX requirements for your disciplinary procedures. If you are a campus that is saying we want to have a separate process for anything that would not meet the definition of sexual harassment under Title IX, then you would maybe have separate definitions or separate processes for things that go beyond the Clery definition of those terms. In your annual security report, you need to have a policy statement that describes your disciplinary procedures for dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And so since those are now part of Title IX, your policy statement in your annual security report should reflect your current policies and procedures, which probably have been recently updated due to the new Title IX regulations. So I know that's all a little confusing and perhaps a little bit beyond what some folks signed up for today. So I hope that that helps to at least clarify the definitions piece. But another helpful resource would be to check out the Title IX section of our Clery Center website, where we did a two podcasts, oh my gosh, no, NACSAM on the brain, 2 webinars back in May with the SUNY Student Conduct Institute, and then we also filmed 3 videos with Victim Rights Law Center that explain different pieces of the Title IX intersections with Clery. So, okay, good. I'm glad if that was helpful. That makes me feel a little bit better because I didn't want to leave you all more confused than we started. Sarah, would you add anything in there, or would you want to touch on anything else about that piece with the definitions that I'm forgetting?
No, I don't have anything else, and actually I am going to put our website and link in the discussion box. So if folks want to navigate over to our website, they can take a look at some of those resources that will hopefully be helpful to them.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I think we have time for one more question here. Oh, I'm so glad that was helpful. Good, I'm glad. We do have one more question here. Should we include the policy in its entirety for 2020 in the ASR, or is the expectation that we will summarize the updated policies in the ASR? So all of the things in an ASR that are called statements of policy or policy statements should be summaries of current existing policies and procedure. Some campuses go the route of straight up copying and pasting an entire 40, 60, 80-page policy and dropping that in the ASR. I personally, and I think Clery Center's position personally, is that can be less helpful than intended because the purpose is to try to provide a summary, a high-level overview. There are required elements that you must speak to in that summary, and that is where the annual security report requirements come in. If you are members of Clery Center, you have access to our annual security report checklist as well as our annual security report review each year. If you are not members and you're interested in considering becoming one, we can share information on membership with you as well, but it's a really valuable way to take advantage of learning more about what needs to be in your annual security report. But if you're not in a position to be able to be a member at this time, which is totally understandable, there are some resources right at the end of that handbook that we were referencing. So Appendix C of the handbook is a checklist developed by the Department of Education to overview all of Clery compliance, and part of that is what needs to be in your annual security report. So when it comes to summarizing your policies and procedures around dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, you could find some helpful information in Appendix C and in Chapter 8 of the handbook. But then on top of that, if you would like a little bit more targeted assistance through our membership program, you can certainly still become a member. And October is the last month of the year where folks could submit their annual security report for review from us. So I can put that link in here as well. But I do know that then we are approaching the end of our time together, unfortunately, and we are very big about not going over. So I will remind you all, if you have a few moments, to complete the survey that is going to come through the discussion pod right now to just let us know feedback on today and on what you might want to have in future months of National Campus Safety Awareness Month. I also just included the link to our membership page of our website in case you're looking for more information there. But other than that, I'll sign off right now, and then I'll let Sarah say goodbye to you all as well. Thank you so much for joining us for this final webinar of this year's National Campus Safety Awareness Month. It was really great learning and chatting with you all. And Sarah, take it away and take us on out.
Thanks so much, Laura. And yes, once again, thank you to everyone who participated today. If you weren't able to catch our first webinar of the month, you can feel free to navigate to our NACSAM webpage where you can find that online. Please check out our podcast because we do have some really great conversations about how we might feature the Clery Act in relation to what's been going on in this historic year. So thanks everyone for participating in our NACSAM 2020 offering. We look forward to another great year in 2021, and we hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thanks so much.